This is awkward, and these are the awkward interviews, now brought to you by my beard. On episode 17, I hosted a man named Ashoka Jagru, who is creator of Copwatch Media and a justice journalist known for his protest coverage. For those who only read social media, you probably only know him as Ash Agony. And during our interview, I learned that that was his rap name years ago. Today, I'm honored to have my second guest from the hip hop community, a political rapper like myself, who's far better known for being the strongest challenger we've ever had to the institution we call plutocrat or performative Pelosi. And here's why. Shahid Buttar has been building social movements and speaking truth to power for nearly 2 decades. I began coordinating with Shahid more than a year ago, first to discuss.
Awkward.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I interrupt there? Just Shahid is how you say my name. I just want to make sure that
Say it
gets
again.
Shahid, like the shaman hid the medicine.
Shahid. What did
Yeah,
I
I get this all day long. So like if we're as long as we're doing the interview and we're recorded, I'd love to just make sure that gets, locked in.
All right. All right,
I figured better sooner rather than later. Sorry.
Yeah, because I would have said it wrong the whole time.
I figured, yeah.
Okay. All right, cool. Starting again. This is awkward, and these are the awkward interviews, now brought to you by my beard. On episode 17, I hosted Ashoka Jagru, creator of Copwatch Media and justice journalist, known for his protest coverage. For those who only read social media, you probably only know him as Ash Agony. And during our interview, I learned that was his rap name from years before. Today, I'm honored to have my second guest from the hip hop community, a political rapper like myself, who's far better known for being the strongest challenger we've ever had to the institution we call plutocrat or performative Pelosi. And here's why. Shahid Buttar has been building social movements and speaking truth to power for nearly 2 decades. I began coordinating with Shahid more than a year ago, first to discuss building dual power to enable a general strike, then when he endorsed the abolitionist 10 demands for justice, next when he helped connect me with the Electronic Frontier Foundation so I could reclaim my Twitter account from hackers, and most recently when I organized a call with Sarah Nelson, head of the Flight Attendants Union, to discuss building up the labor movement. Since graduating from Stanford Law School in 2003, Shahid has worked in San Francisco and Washington as a legal advocate and grassroots organizer focused on putting human rights and needs before corporate profits. An early advocate for marriage equality for same-sex couples and a prolific organizer in the movement to end warrantless government surveillance, Shahid most recently built a national grassroots network for the aforementioned Electronic Frontier Foundation as the organization's director of grassroots advocacy. Shahid's work has also advanced immigrant rights, campaign finance reform, government transparency, international human rights, and police accountability, something very important to me. His writing for Huffington Post, Truth Out, TechCrunch, Project Censored, and a variety of legal journals has addressed a wide range of issues from the right-wing attack on reproductive freedom to the erosion of voting rights, and from effective counterterrorism to examples of countercultural activism. As a national nonprofit leader, he built a progressive legal network at the American Constitution Society. He founded a program at Muslim Advocates in San Francisco to challenge racial and religious profiling by federal agencies, something that they have been doing for generations. For 6 years, Shahid led the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, which is now known as Defending Rights and Dissent, an organization that was founded in response to Joe Biden's Patriot Act. Shahid is an immigrant of Pakistani descent from the UK, and after Trump's election, he founded Movement, a series of quarterly parties in San Francisco supporting local nonprofits that serve immigrant communities. Shahid also serves on the boards of directors of the Center for Media Justice, Defending Rights and Dissent, and the Fund for Constitutional Government. In March 2020, The Intercept ran a story entitled "Nancy Pelosi to Receive First Genuine Left-Wing Challenge in 30 Years." And the results set a record among campaigns to ever face Pelosi and forced a half a dozen policy concessions from her. Shahid was endorsed by my friends, Left Flank Vets, People for Bernie, Women for Justice, Harvard Law School professor Lawrence Lessig, my hero, Dr. Cornell West, my friends Linda Sarsauer and Susan Sarandon, my recent guest on this show, Marianne Williamson, who ran for president in 2020, and the late, great Mike Gravel, who left us this past week. Of course, some of you may know Shahid from the fallout of being a congressional candidate hit with a since debunked series of allegations of misconduct. As Shahid told me, Dem Party operatives lied about me in a half a dozen different ways, shifted their narratives, and accused me in writing of assault before admitting to The Intercept that it was a mistake, in quotes. Shahid, welcome. It is my policy to believe victims, but it seems you may be one of those leaders who was falsely accused for political purposes. You're not the only one. And some have even called it a character assassination resulting from white supremacy. It certainly impacted the campaign. I can't imagine how effective it would have been since you still garnered the most votes against Pelosi in history. So let's start there. And then I'd love to hear your thoughts on former Senator Mike Gravel and the Washington Post's obituary headline referring to him merely as a gadfly senator with a flair for the theatrical.
Jesus. Yeah. I mean, just to look at last year, I'm quite proud to have been the strongest challenger to the current Speaker of the House over the course of the generation that she's held the seat. And, if it weren't for the character assassination that you described and the failures of journalists, both every journalist in San Francisco and many well beyond it, I frankly think I might be in Congress already. The only thing that protected Pelosi and kept her in office is the fact that she was able to get away with ducking debates. And if we had ethical journalism in this country, if we had writers who checked their facts and their sources, we wouldn't be in this position. And I'd hopefully be in a position in that case to be empowering the squad at the moment. Instead, we're in a different timeline, and we're fighting for democracy at a time when it's in exile. That requires, among other things, for incumbents to show up for debates. It requires journalists to ask for debates. It requires journalists to fact check their sources. And none of those things happened in the last cycle. So it's hard for me to look at the 2020 election as entirely legitimate, but yet in spite of all those headwinds and a global pandemic, we still won 81,000 votes. That's enough to get a seat in most districts. And while it wasn't enough here, we did more than double our vote count from the primary. And as bloodied as I emerged from that saga, I frankly am quite emboldened by it. It did turn my beard gray. When you talked about believing victims, I would just invite you to consider any number of the whistleblowers here who were bullied and threatened for trying to speak the truth and silenced by the press, and the entire Democratic Party establishment, which stooped to say unethical depths would be frankly quite charitable. I mean, these were attacks straight out of the Jim Crow South. Lies, coordinated, orchestrated lies, supported by local politicians. I mean, it's dark, and I'm quite eager for some journalists to finally write the story. I mean, I think there's a Pulitzer Prize here for whoever will actually dig in and uncover the plot. And the whistleblowers themselves, having been silenced for as long as they have been, they're seeking their own channels now to tell their own experiences. And I'm grateful to all the San Franciscans who saw through the lies. And it was pretty transparently obvious to me as the subject of them that it was all done in bad faith. I'm glad to see as many people have recognized that, chime on. I wish that journalists practiced ethical journalism. And I think if they did, none of this would have been an issue, because all of these stories were politically motivated. And just to be clear, to accuse people of color of sexual misconduct for political purposes is no less racist than burning a cross on someone's lawn. And that's what the entire Democratic Party in San Francisco, and I'm talking about from the bottom to the top, was complicit in. And as much as I think it limited our results in 2020, in this moment of racial reckoning, I'm quite proud to stand on this hill. I grew up in rural Missouri as an immigrant, as a Muslim immigrant, and I've been mugged by police in Chicago. I've been called Osama by people passing protests out of their pickup trucks, and never have I been treated in any way, even remotely comparably, in terms of the racism that I encountered, to how I experienced the institutional press and even the independent press in San Francisco as a congressional candidate in 2020. And I see it as for me, a moment of learning, an opportunity. I got racialized last year in a way that I never had been before, and that opened my eyes to a great many things. And I do expect it to make me a better representative when I have the privilege and honor of casting votes on behalf of my city in Congress.
Thank you. That was a really great response, and I think it in addition to what it says about you and just supporting my experiences with you, that left me totally shocked when all of this stuff started flooding out without any fact checking whatsoever, it seemed. It also says a lot about the other half of that question, which was Mike Gravel and how he was referred, because we're talking both about the Democratic establishment and how different he was and how maybe he would have been written differently had he been a different senator. And it says a lot about journalists and at least the mainstream media in kind of defining the entirety of his career and human being as that.
Mike Gravel was a bona fide, full-on national hero with very few peers. I mean, a national hero of the sort that like John Revere and Dwight Eisenhower were heroes, right? I mean, Mike Gravel, just for people who don't understand the significance of what he did, he was the lone member of Congress who was willing to stand with the whistleblower when someone came out of the military establishment to reveal that the Pentagon, the Defense Department, the federal government for years was not only lying to the American public, but effectively continuing a French colonial enterprise in Southeast Asia and sending ultimately 50,000 Americans to their early graves in the service of killing at least 1 million and some number of millions of people across multiple countries. And that even that doesn't capture the half of it. I mean, what we did in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia amounted to ecocide. We were indiscriminately poisoning rainforests to destroy life there so that we could capture people trying to liberate their country from an invading force. To bring this full circle, now I'm going to come back to Mike Gravel at the end of this. Many people around the world have seen the Star Wars trilogy. George Lucas has been outspoken that he wrote the original movie as an allegory for the Vietnam War, and the empire was the United States. That's what Mike Gravel thought. Mike Gravel was like an actual real life Jedi. He read the Pentagon Papers into the congressional record. That's why the Washington Post wants to reduce him to being a gadfly, because he's one of the only members of Congress in the entire last century to show up for work. When we talk about the oath of office, to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that includes taking unpopular stances to do the right thing. That is a constitutional commitment. And too many people in Congress are simply politicians. They just do what's popular. And at a moment like this, and when I say a moment like this, I mean the last 70 years since our government has been committed to imperial military industrial resource extraction from around the world, ecocide, basically, in the service of capital. In that political context, politicians are not qualified to serve in Congress because we can't have people who are used to doing the popular thing trying to combat a corrupt system. We need people who are willing to do the right thing, even when it's unpopular. People like Mike Gravel. When I was fighting for marriage equality in 2004, it was not popular. No Democrats supported us. My client was a Green Party mayor from New Paltz, New York. Nancy Pelosi certainly didn't support it. She didn't support marriage equality for same-sex couples for another 10 years, with all the privilege and power of the Speaker of the House. I'm an immigrant Muslim from the Midwest, and I was fighting in court for my gay neighbors in 2004. Was not popular. When I fought the Obama administration from the left, it wasn't popular. All of my liberal friends were co-opted by this basically bipartisan authoritarianism that's been lurking and growing ever since. When I fought the Speaker of the House, the leader of the Democratic Party, it wasn't popular. I don't do things because they're popular. I do things because they're right. And because I stand on principle, it just so happens that over the last generation, history is more, it's just over and over again vindicated, you know, and I frankly would rather step around some of these pitfalls and help us make better decisions as a civilization rather than be stuck in the corner saying, I told you so, you know, and like, that's where we've all been, all of us activists who've been building the climate justice movement, who've been building the movement for universal healthcare, who've been building the movement to defund police and create better alternatives that can actually promote public safety, building the movement to abolish ICE and once again, respect immigrant rights. All of us stand in the footsteps of Mike Gravel, because Mike Gravel was willing to do the unpopular thing for the right reason. He was willing to expose corruption, to stand for peace and justice, to defend the Constitution against domestic enemies. And domestic enemies of our Constitution have been ruling this country for the last 3 generations. And to see a member of Congress like him, for me, as an immigrant, endorse our campaign to replace Nancy Pelosi. I mean, I'm very proud of many of the endorsements, Dr. West in particular, I mean, I think I cried in joy that night, and more in terms of just communing with the universe, to have his support for me felt so incredibly humbling. I mean, still I get shaky just even thinking about it, It's an incredible honor to have the support of somebody like that. I mean, I have such deep and wide-ranging respect and admiration for his voice, for Mary Ann's, for Lawrence Lessig's. I had the honor and privilege of working for him many years ago. But Mike Gravel's endorsement for me felt so incredibly poignant. I mean, there's nobody in our nation's history by whom I have been comparably inspired. And to stand in his footsteps and to have the opportunity to carry his legacy forward is one by which I am very humbled and
committed.
I'm eager to do it. Someone has to continue his legacy.
Yeah.
His legacy is more important than anything else. And, whether it's me or someone else, I see, frankly, Ilhan Omar doing a great job of it now in Congress, and I see her needing some backup. There's a particular thing with respect to Ilhan and the attacks on her recently that I'd love to get into at some point, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, I mean, she's certainly also a victim of trolls, and that, that's what I was thinking of is,
Yes,
anyone who is fighting the status quo, who's willing to do what's unpopular, is going to face people that will do anything to shut them down, including fabricate stories about them and assassinate their character. And the higher your profile, the bigger and more effective and dangerous those trolls are. So when you're running against a Nancy Pelosi, you're going to face the kind of trolls that will get articles published in mainstream media, which, is a pretty daunting foe. And, I've seen you persevere through all of that. And, you mentioned lifelong politicians. You meant, and you mentioned Ilhan is another victim of this type of attack. But I also, see the squad in general, which you said, had you gotten to where you probably should be, you would be, I think you said empowering them. I believe that you'd be working, hopefully, to push them left. What we've seen or to push them back left,
right.
where
They'd be in a very different place if Pelosi weren't there.
Yes.
Right. A lot of people
Yeah.
blame the squad for things that are ultimately Pelosi's fault. And it's a problem for our movement because so many people have grown disillusioned thinking that politics can't work because the few people we have in Congress are under the bus. But I would just remind people who's driving the bus. Don't blame the people under it. If we were to drill down on this in terms of the analysis of the squad, and I totally get your concern.
But that's exactly what I was going to say is what you're saying, that people are disillusioned. There is the belief from so many that if they have a D next to their name, no matter what they sound like, look like, what their background is, what the work they've done all these years leading up to this, that they're not a trained politician, but they're a movement person, doesn't matter because they're going to turn into what the squad is turned into. And I think a lot of people are missing what we just can't know, not being in their shoes, which is what you're touching on, the position they've been put in under a Nancy Pelosi.
And I would say, that just to be very direct about this in terms of the force the vote analysis, I think a lot of people internalize this cynical narrative coming out of that episode. The first thing I would just say, force the vote was a day late and $1 short. The point at which we had Nancy Pelosi on the ropes was not in December. It was in November when I had her on the ballot for the first time in a generation. And to all the people who showed up to force the vote, I would just say you showed up late. So first of all, don't act like it's holier than thou because people didn't stand with it. Secondly, when we look at the force the vote strategy, it was premised on the idea that the squad votes as a block, but the squad isn't a block. It's just a bunch of young progressives who get labeled together. They're not all Ilhan. If they were all Ilhan Omar, they could have forced a vote. But Ayanna Pressley's not Ilhan Omar. Most of them aren't Ilhan Omar. Ilhan Omar is a standard bearer. She will fight power and take hits for it. And I just want to connect her to the Mike Gravel legacy. So Mike Gravel read the Pentagon Papers into the congressional record to expose and end the war in Vietnam, bring down the Nixon administration. What Ilhan Omar just did 2 weeks ago was simply say that the nation that proudly fought the Second World War and won it to establish an international human rights regime should Maybe we should abide by international human rights and respect the jurisdiction of the institutions that we created and the legal precedents that we sent a Supreme Court justice to prosecute at the Nuremberg trials 70 years ago. That should not be a controversial proposition. Instead, she gets vilified by the entire Democratic leadership, which unites to call her remarks offensive, demand clarification. And I want to get sharp about this because the entire field of journalists in our vaunted free country with our free press could not muster the independence to observe that the Speaker of the House has an individual conflict of interest, an individual international criminal conflict of interest. In 2006, Pelosi gets read into CIA torture, okay, what the agency called enhanced interrogation. When she then covered it up, which she's been doing now for 15 years while representing the city in Congress where the United Nations was founded, well, instead of investigating as international law requires under a mandatory obligation, she covered it up. Okay, so what does that mean? The cover-up is criminal, independent of and beyond the original torture itself. It's so bad that even Senator Dianne Feinstein, who frankly is just a rubber stamp for government abuses as a senior senator who led the Senate Intelligence Committee for entirely too long, even she was driven, compelled to show up on the Senate floor under the Obama administration. This is 2013, maybe 2014, somewhere between 2013 and 15. For me, the dates are fuzzy. I haven't looked this up in a while, but I think it might've been 2013. She shows up on the floor of the Senate decrying a constitutional crisis under Obama. This is before Trump, okay? It's been getting worse and worse for not the last 20 years, but as you put it in the intro, in decades, we've been embracing outright lawlessness. But in this context with torture, so Dianne Feinstein's decrying a constitutional crisis over torture, which she investigated. The CIA ends up hacking her staff to hide evidence of its criminal trail. Now, come to 2020, Ilhan says, let's respect the jurisdiction of the criminal court. When Nancy Pelosi is punching down and left at a Black Muslim woman in Congress who's willing to actually speak the truth, what is she doing? Is that just the institutional corruption of the military industrial complex protecting itself from a refugee in Congress? It's that too. But we're talking about someone who could herself, Nancy Pelosi herself, in addition to the entire leadership of the CIA, could face justice in The Hague if we did accept the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction, which is to say it's all a cover your ass move by a rich, wealthy dynasty politician who is trying to evade international justice. And not a single journalist in the United States has the independence to observe it. And I ran for office to defend democracy from corrupt intelligence agencies. And I ended up having to also then fight the corruption of a dynasty politician. I have discovered that I also have to confront the corruption of a local party establishment. And I don't know if it's the corruption or the erosion or just the collapse of the free press as well. The levers of our democracy are profoundly broken. Many of them are. And it's in that context that we're running. And, that constitutional sensibility I was talking with you about before, that Gravel shared, that Ilhan shared, that I think not everyone in the squad shares, that I would empower the squad by adding another number of people with that sensibility. And frankly, the biggest contribution I'd make at that outset would simply be by removing the impediment, the bus driver who was driving the bus over the rest of them.
Yeah. And, quickly back to the media, it's the mainstream media, it's so clear is not going to publish something you just said, like they're not going to investigate something like that puts the entire institution on trial. But the scarier, sadder, more frustrating and anger provoking part is the lapse from the independent media. Right. If we're not getting that kind of coverage from people like me, in better and bigger positions, but still not controlled by corporations, then what is their purpose? And what are they selling out to? Like, there might be corporate ties that are less well known, or political ties that are less well known, that are corrupting every corner of the journalism world. And that is a scary thought.
We encountered dark money in the independent media establishment here in San Francisco. Independent journalists dark money and character assassination, smears, white supremacy, the Democratic establishment, that whole nine.
Yeah.
But when we talk about the independent press and the context of challenging militarism, there are plenty of great people out there doing good work. I mean, I want to shout out the like Ronnie Akaleks, the Abby Martins of the world. There's plenty of people who are challenging militarism. When I note this part about Pelosi's corruption, it's just interesting to me that this particular angle somehow goes completely unobserved. So there are, I think, independent voices in the independent press.
But you named like the two I might have thought of myself, so that's a problem. Like, there aren't enough.
Not nearly enough. Not nearly enough. Well, and I would particularly challenge those who do have audiences, like Crystal and Sagar and Brianna and Virgil. Like, talk about these issues. Imperialism matters, and the corruption of the individuals who are casting the votes matters. And I think that systemic analysis, the discussion of the day-to-day knife fight in Washington, all that matters too, but there is a layer of observation that is going entirely missing. I do think of it as frankly shameful for outlets like The Intercept not to be covering the fact that Pelosi has a conflict of interest while she's punching down and left at Ilhan. That's kind of what they're there for. And if there was any outlet by whose ethical lapses and failings I've been serially most disappointed, I would say that's the institution.
Because you held them to a higher regard. You expected more of them.
I would just expect them to hold them to their own standard, right? I mean, the standard that they've established in investigative reporting is just so far beyond the absence of any standard in their political reporting. And what I'm talking about now with the Pelosi conflict of interest, that's actually in the zone that they've historically demonstrated some rigor, and yet still, these very crucial observations go unnoticed. And, it's one of those challenges that we confront in terms of a broken media landscape, such that even people who are paying attention in the electorate can't often get their access to information because it's not being disseminated. Yeah. It really does force all of us in this moment into a position of needing to be, and I mean this in a positive way, hyperactive citizens. Like the burden of citizenship at a time like this is not merely to show up and vote. We have to actively inform ourselves, and whatever channels we might have used to defer to, frankly, it's not enough to say that they're not trustworthy, because I think everybody is trustworthy at points, but you can't really accept any one set of things you hear or any one set of voices anymore, if only because everybody's got something that they're hawking or some set of things that they're co-opted by. Yeah. And so I think if you examine multiple sources, it tends to be much easier to find your way to the truth. And so I would just particularly invite everybody listening to practice engaged citizenship. And part of what that means is search for the truth actively, because no one's going to give it to you. No one's going to deliver it to you reliably. And I'm grateful for the journalism that you're doing and other grassroots journalists filling the gap. But particularly at this layer of investigation, the collapse of investigative capacity in the press is a constitutional crisis in itself. And the fact of the matter is, at the moment, this is a good point in time to reflect upon this. It's summer of 2021. We have no idea what the worst crimes of the Trump administration were. No one has any clue. Congress hasn't investigated the CIA in 40 years. There were coups in Brazil, Bolivia, and Venezuela twice in the last 4 years. What was the CIA's role there? Does anybody know? I don't know. But the head of state of Brazil, who executed a coup to depose a democratically elected left-wing government, he was the first foreign head of state to ever speak at the CIA's headquarters in Langley. What does that tell you? And now he's waging an ecocide and a war on indigenous people, an assault on human rights across Brazil, enabled by the Trump administration, and still in office effectively, right? And the idea that we see human rights on the chopping block, not just there, not just in the Philippines. I'm thinking at the moment about and this will connect back to the crisis in independent journalists we were talking about, the prosecution of Julian Assange is a constitutional crisis. And all the independent press should frankly be screaming bloody murder about it. The institutional press should be too, but the fact that they're not, it is, and this moment, I get flabbergasted. It's just how so many voices that claim to care about journalism or democracy can bury their heads in the sand at a moment when a publisher is being prosecuted for revealing government secrets. And whatever people think of Assange in the context of his most recently prolific revelations, I just want to remind them of what he did before, because I think it was 2006, 2007, the Collateral Murder video. Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and Chelsea Manning, the reason Chelsea Manning has been tortured and prosecuted and vilified and chased and smeared in the years since, what they revealed was the US military killing journalists and then covering it up. And now you have journalists deferring to the prosecution, not revealing the fact that even the prosecution's star witnesses over the weekend just revealed that even their stories were concocted. This is the biggest story in journalism, and somehow it's not on the front page. And we started on all this whole tangent around Gravel. When Gravel was reading the Pentagon Papers into the Congressional Record, it was front page news. The Justice Department ended up suing 17 different newspapers around the country to try to keep it out of the news. And the newspaper said, hell no, we have a job to do. We're here to inform the American public. And what happened to that?
That's a dangerous reality, that it's getting so significantly worse. And, we're hearing less and less and being filled with more and more nonsense. And the whole idea of human rights, the international human rights, and what followed World War II, that is like, for them, not for us. We only entered World War II because we got bombed. We didn't really care that Jews were being slaughtered by the millions. And, then when we created, these international laws and organizations, that was for everyone except us. We never stopped. I think we probably increased the fervency with which we were going all over the place and cooing whoever we wanted, as who said that? Oh my God, the CEO of the car
United
company.
Fruit?
No, the electric car company. This
Tesla? Elon Musk?
Elon Musk.
Okay, got it. Sorry.
He replied to no, it's my fault. He replied to one of my friends on Twitter, we'll coup whoever we want. Mind blowing, the arrogance, and it's. But like,
he could have let a United Fruit with an attitude like that. He probably, wow.
Yeah, he's not afraid,
Right.
So before we move into some other areas, let's just round out the Nancy Pelosi institution. What were some of the capitulations you were able to get her to offer or succumb to? And then I know that you haven't stopped. So what's coming up that you're hoping to get her to move on?
Appreciate that. So yeah, first with respect to last year, this was all before the character assassination started, when I was credibly threatening the seat and plan to again, just to see what else we can win from her. But the 6 different areas where Nancy Pelosi caved in the face of our campaign last year, and these were areas where proposals ended up passing the House of Representatives that she opposed until she flipped, included generational advances in both worker rights and policing. That's the Protecting Right to Organize Act and the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, a bill that funded the U.S. Postal Service. One stopped a war in Iran. It was a War Powers Amendment. She didn't support the one that we wanted her to, which was introduced by Barbara Lee and Ro Khanna here in the Bay Area. She ended up signing on to another one, but she at least moved from her original position. And then 2 different impeachment resolutions to at least seek accountability from a criminal president. And she botched both of them by limiting them. And I said that she botched them at the immediate outset because it was obvious that she was showing up like a boxer throwing a fight. But in each of those instances, we moved her from her initial position. No campaign's ever done that before. We did it 6 different times. And because the particular incumbent who I'm holding accountable as a challenger is the Speaker of the House, not just a vote among 400 people, but like the vote. For a while, our campaign was like the tail wagging the dog of the entire US House of Representatives. And the idea that the Protecting Right to Organize Act passed the House, that's huge. I mean, this is a generational transformation in labor rights. It would enable workplace organizing in a way that hasn't been true in decades. And it is striking to me that the first time this very powerful Democrat ever showed up for labor rights was the first time she had another Democrat on the ballot. And it speaks to me about the value of accountability. It speaks to me also about the predictability of the kind of character assassination we described. It's much easier for an establishment to do a spin move than actually grapple with democratic accountability. And the last thing I'd say here in terms of the policy concessions, and this is especially important for the force the vote crowd to get, it shows that we, the movement, have influence vastly more than we might think. Frankly, for me, the 2020 campaign was wildly more successful than I ever dreamed it to be. I mean, the 81,000 votes, setting the record that was 30% more than any previous campaign to win against her, that was a good enough. I mean, I would like, frankly, to win the seat, but I was surprised by the 81,000 votes in the wake of everything I'd been through by that point. But the policy concessions, that was a bigger prize than the seat. If I win the race and I get a seat in Congress, I'm a junior person casting one vote among 435. But when the person I'm able to get to show up for work is the Speaker of the House, I mean, we had more influence over federal policy last year than I have ever dreamed. I had way more influence over federal policy than I would as a freshman congressman, right? And to have pulled that lever successfully, to get the Protecting Right to Organize Act through the House, to get the Justice and Policing Act through the House, and I have a critique of it, particularly around body cameras, but still, a whole bunch of parts of it I've been advocating for 20 years, and Pelosi never supported them. And the idea that she gets any credit for passing it through the House when she built the system that killed George Floyd, whose name she couldn't even remember at the press conference to introduce the bill that she named after him, and doing this absurdly hypocritical cultural appropriation farce of donning kente cloth while kneeling in Congress. I mean, just the theater was worse than the substance even. But it passed the House. Nothing like that ever passed the House before. I see the results of 2020 as us and I can't even honestly claim by any design. I mean, I theoretically understood the idea of holding an incumbent accountable, and I certainly was, very eager to offer alternatives. It wasn't really on my mind that she was going to start biting off pieces of our agenda. That wasn't something I really anticipated. But when she started doing it, I was like, A, wow, that's cool. B, well, that kind of sucks because that took that off the table. But C, hell yeah, let's run that play again. And that's why I'm going to relaunch. To get to your next question, we're about a month off of relaunching. I see last year as a process that did leave me bloodied, turned my beard white, trashed my name certainly. And, I'm not going to walk away due to the corruption of a local political establishment, especially when there are issues left to fight for and win. Medicare for all, we need a vote on Medicare for all. And until it happens, someone's got to hold her accountable, and no one else is particularly positioned to. We need a Green New Deal. This state is poised to burn. Yet again, we're having a historic heat wave right now. The Pacific Northwest, the roads are melting. It is so hot. It was 114 degrees yesterday in Portland. There's a part of the country that my parents migrated from, Pakistan, where the temperature at the moment is in the 140s. It's surpassed the point at which it's survivable for human beings. That's the state of climate change at the moment, while entire islands in the South Pacific are being submerged. And Nancy Pelosi wants to deride the Green New Deal as a dream or whatever. That's what she calls it. There was just a protest. A bunch of activists, dozens of Sunrise activists, marched from Paradise, California, which burned a few years ago, to the mansions of Nancy Pelosi and Dianne Feinstein to spread wildfire ash on their houses. And their houses, incidentally, are surrounded by palatial, green, manicured lawns in the middle of a state suffering a catastrophic drought. And I could not imagine a more visible symbol of the two-tiered society where we live in, where we have plutocrats, fabulously wealthy people who think that they're doing us a favor somehow by staying in Congress into their 80s, basically constraining the future and chaining it to the past. And then we have the rest of us. We have the 8-year-old who went up into Dianne Feinstein's office last year. We were with her on the street. She goes upstairs, has this conversation in a small room, recorded. Everybody's seen the video with Dianne Feinstein shaming her and saying, oh, you should listen to me. I know what I'm talking about. You didn't vote for me anyway. They came down out of the office crying because she was so mean to them. I had no idea the moment was going to go viral. Half an hour later, I'm at the office. I happen to, look at Twitter, and this, moment is blowing up. And I see Feinstein and Pelosi return to Congress because the press refuses to hold them accountable or point out the fact that they are. And I want to, with Pelosi, when I was talking before about the criminal conflict of interest and the International Criminal Court and the crisis in journalism, I want to hit this a whole other different way. The San Francisco Chronicle a week ago publishes the story noting that the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program funds that were passed in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic to support small businesses and enabling them to continue their payrolls, even when the lockdowns were in place, the PPP funds dried out right before they were fully distributed. And the SF Chronicle does this whole statistical analysis to show how wealthy white areas across the Bay Area got all the money, how the brown, black minority areas of the Bay Area were more or less shut out. And I wrote a letter to the editor, which of course the San Francisco Chronicle did not publish, making the point that this isn't just census tract level data. Let's get real about this. Our city is represented in Washington by Nancy Pelosi. She wrote the legislation. Her husband owns businesses that were getting PPP funds. How is that any different than Donald Trump taking taxpayer money and putting it in his pocket, right? Every time he took the Secret Service to one of his resorts and he's billing out the rooms at $400 a night, that's going straight into his pocket. How is that any different? The corruption that we confront in Washington is thoroughly bipartisan. It is both institutional and individuated. And that combination is particularly pernicious when the press somehow finds itself practicing stenography instead of critical examination of the gulf, the chasm between the rhetoric of our government officials and the reality of our government's actions. And that chasm has to be bridged. Democracy cannot survive that chasm.
Yeah, and it's you know, your experience in 2020 and the effect you had on Pelosi definitely shows something that a lot of people are missing, which is that, you know, yes, we may not get into office, and yes, when we do, we may not have the power we'd like, and we may, you know, not be as radical in the things we're pushing for or voting for or against, but just by running, we change the conversation.
Right.
Janos Martin did the same thing running early on for DA in New York City. He's a friend of mine. He completely changed the conversation. And, you know, he's an abolitionist. He also endorsed the 10 demands. And they wouldn't be talking about the things they were talking about in the debates, and being forced to answer to what the public actually wants if there weren't people putting in the work, the effort, taking the risk to run. So short of a full-scale revolution, or building the, you know, mutual aid networks we need to threaten a general strike and go through with it if and when they don't meet our needs, this is kind of all we have. Like we can't just stop running people who are on the correct side. And so, you know, I'm very thankful for people like yourself who are willing to do it all over again after such a traumatic experience the last time around. That takes a lot of guts, honestly.
I appreciate that. Thank you, brother.
Yeah. So before I let you go, because I try to keep these, you know, about an hour, you know, tell me, I have, just because it's probably the, you know, the main interest of my audience, and certainly what I have focused most of my career on, the George Floyd Act. You know, you mentioned you have some concerns with it, as I have publicly stated of my own. It gives $750 million more to police, and wouldn't even make what happened to George Floyd illegal. There is an alternative that has gotten no support called the Breathe Act, that the movement for Black Lives has been influential in putting together. And then there's, of course, the 10 demands that we created, which many aspects of which could be incorporated into federal legislation. As far as I'm concerned, if we're giving more money to police, it is a reform that only strengthens the institution.
Right.
If we're not chipping away at the carceral state, it is not the kind of reform we should be supporting. It is incrementalism at best. And you did support 10 demands. So what are your thoughts on the movement to defund the police to zero toward abolition? What do you think explain to those who don't understand, what it means in your mind to defund the police? Because you kind of touched on it earlier. And, and then what is your thought on the future? Where would you like to see our so-called criminal justice system be in the future?
So many thoughts here. Just to start with the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, the things about it that I'm excited for are like the ending qualified immunity, the data collection about the racial impacts of stops and arrests to be able to better document profiling, all that stuff that frankly should have passed 20 years ago. There was a bill the End Racial Profiling Act, which Congress has never passed. I've been advocating for it since 2008, and Nancy Pelosi has never supported it, just to be clear. And many of its components are embodied in the Justice and Policing Act. That's why I support it, despite its misgivings. What you described right there about the budget increases, huge difference here between when we end qualified immunity, as I proposed in 2018, years before George was killed. There's a bifurcation here between individual accountability and institutional accountability. In other words, the Justice and Policing Act would enhance individual accountability by taking off the table a judicial doctrine that was invented to shield agents and police, not departments, but officers, individual officers, from accountability for their various violations. And then the department level accountability, which is moving in the other direction with increased budgets. So in other words, even the nods at individual officer accountability that the system has been willing to pay or heed our movement's demands for justice have been offset by a continued institutional attempt to co-opt our movements, a bait and switch, a hide and seek, a now you see it, now you don't. It's like a 3-card Monte game or something, and most of the Justice and Policing Act is really, really important. And then it's got this huge turd attached to it. And it's not just money for police departments, it's surveillance for police departments, police body cameras. And this is the thing I have to talk about as long as we're touching on it. I wrote an article many years ago, 2015, I think, in Truth Out, about spelling out the problems with police body cameras. And they can be useful tools in a city where public defenders get access to exculpatory information and body camera footage routinely. And I understand that in San Francisco, thankfully, we do. And there have been cases where the SF Public Defender's Office has been able to leverage body cam footage to exonerate people. And I'm glad for that. That is absolutely the exception that generally proves the rule. Everywhere else, that body camera footage much more frequently puts people behind bars, and not cops, than it does hold ever police accountable. And there are several reasons for that. One is that they don't face the officers. They reinforce the officer's field of vision, not what the officer is doing, unless they put their hands in front of them. So what they're doing off camera is anybody's guess. Furthermore, police body cameras aren't just points of dumb surveillance on a million armed to the teeth police officers around the country. They're very sophisticated surveillance instruments, in most places running facial recognition algorithms on top of them, which are known to be biased. So we're talking about basically taking the NSA's mass surveillance, high-tech electronic mass communications monitoring, and adding to it street surveillance of the sort never before practiced in human civilization, leveraging comparably sophisticated surveillance to subject the entire United States to physical observation and recording. That is horrifying from a civil liberties standpoint. It is like the nightmare. It's exactly what the founders wrote a constitution to try to prevent. And our movement's demands for accountability are being used as a pretext to effectuate this. So there is a very sordid, again, combination of things being presented at once. Stepping beyond the Justice and Policing Act, looking at abolition as a longer term project. Absolutely critical. Just this week, actually, or last week, pardon me, Oakland, across the bay here, shifted $18 million from its police budget into better alternatives that could actually keep the community safe, like crisis response teams to respond to people who are having mental health crises, or homeless folks who are, in some kind of situation where they need services, but not somebody with a gun or a taser that they can't tell the difference between. And a huge shout out to all of the activists and the electeds in Oakland who made that happen. That was a big, big deal. A position of national leadership, frankly, that I do hope that San Francisco and Congress learn from. Now, when we talk about defunding the police, my sort of like initial objectives there are to make sure that policing is not a profit center for anyone. Private prisons should not exist. Military contractors selling weapons to police departments, this is exactly what Eisenhower warned us to look out for. The profit motive in policing is at least one part of the problem. It's not the only problem. The bigger problem at a more like fundamental level is that police are not there to keep people safe. That's not the purpose. Police were built, constructed, funded. They remain dedicated to protecting property, not people. And there's a big difference between the two, with vast implications for public safety that people who dismiss defund the police as an uncompelling slogan do not understand. I'm not interested in slogans. When I say defund the police, it's not a slogan. It is a demand. And it's a demand of people who are tired of seeing their neighbors come home in coffins at the hands of people that are being paid public dollars to supposedly keep us safe. That is the perverse irony of all this, that anyone has the audacity to talk about public safety and act as if police promote it, when in too many of our communities, it is the police who are the threat to public safety. And when we recognize that, that is the grand implication of every one of these videos that we've seen. If people step back from the video and move beyond individuated assessment to understand what this means for institutions and the ongoing impunity at the institutional level, even notwithstanding and despite the very welcome verdict for Derek Chauvin, there's been a whole bunch of debate about, is it too long? Should he not face justice? If anybody's facing justice for anything, that man should be in prison. Okay, just let's be clear about that. And if we want to have visionary debates about what the alternative should be, cops who kill people viciously in broad daylight should not be granted any clemency. Okay, and I'm all for reducing penalties across the board. And when we get to a different system and a different culture, we can have that debate. If anybody belongs in prison, it is that man and entirely too many other police officers around the United States. Anyway, so when I say defund the police, I want to distinguish between near-term time slice and the longer-term vision. And there was a point, you actually very cleverly articulated it in framing the question. When I say defund the police, I think a lot of people respond to it as if it's a slogan saying defund the police to zero. I actually don't mean that in the near-term time slice. I mean what Oakland did. Let's start shifting money out. Same thing at the Pentagon. It's true at the national level too. Let's take some of that Pentagon money and put it into USAID. Let's take that money from the Pentagon and give it to the Peace Corps. Let's take that money from the Pentagon and put it into regenerative agriculture grants to help the developing world deal with the climate crisis. Let's do something useful with our money instead of just bombing people. That's what the defund the police means in the federal level. At the local level, it means crisis response teams. It means social workers. It means getting teachers a living wage so they don't have to, sell things to try to buy school supplies for their kids. It's getting parents the resources they need so that their kids don't have to be at risk. It's dealing with poverty so that the drivers of criminality do not exist. It's getting at the root causes instead of just dealing with the symptoms. It's almost as if policing is like a Band-Aid or allopathic medicine when we could instead get at the root. And when I think of defund the police over the course of time, as our civilization changes and we deal with those root causes, then we can maybe defund the police and the Pentagon down to zero. I mean, that's the thing we could talk about when the time comes. But I think too many people presume that defund means to zero. And what I mean when I say defund the police, I mean refund our communities, invest in things that will keep people alive and thriving instead of armed to the teeth paramilitaries who know only violence. There are better ways to serve people, and so many. Mental health especially is worth like double, triple underscoring here. The combination of homelessness and mental health crises are frankly how a lot of people end up dead at the hands of police. And it's completely inexcusable because there's no reason that police should ever be dealing with anyone in that circumstance. It's completely unnecessary. There was a point in our nation's history when we had institutions for folks, federal institutions that Reagan dismantled. And the idea that we are now dealing with the most overlooked and vulnerable, marginalized people in our society with violence instead of care, I think, frankly, is a shameful reflection of just the collapse of our civilization's moral standing, our own self-awareness, our dedication to any kind of principle. And that's exactly what I want to fix in Congress.
Wow, beautifully said. I would vote for you. The only thing I would say, because that was truly, an answer, to my heart, or however you want to word that, is that I would say it's not that we don't want to defund to zero, or even that we want to necessarily wait to have the conversation. It's just that it's just that one of the primary misconceptions about defund the police is that we mean to zero overnight.
Right.
And and you essentially said that. But that's the difference, is that we today could not do that and be in a good place. We need to build these alternative mechanisms that you're talking about so that over time, as we're defunding and funding the communities, we can actually get to zero. But no, it is not lawlessness, and it is not overnight. It's an alternative to the violence that we have today.
Public safety instead of paramilitarization, basically.
Yep, 100%.
Yeah.
And I do really like the way you ended it, that it is like a blight on our culture. The way we respond to need with violence says a lot about who we are. And it's not something we should be proud of. Finally, as a fellow musician and someone who has always, from day one, used my music strictly for the sake of getting a message across.
Yes.
Tell me about the power of music and art in influencing politics.
It's the thing, man. I mean, I'll be honest with you. I always wanted to be a musician who dabbled in politics, and I've ended up being a politician who dabbles in music. But, I see the John Lennons of the world, the Stevie Wonders of the world, the jazz movement of the early part of the century. Musicians are revolutionaries, the real ones, the ones who are like, use their art to tell stories. I mean, the art is the expression of our experiences and our lives and our voices. And when people actually tell their experiences, and when they use their platform insightfully to tell not their own experiences only, but the experiences of our communities, it is profound. For me as an MC, Chuck D was just a huge inspiration, as well as Speech from Arrested Development, that whole era, early 90s conscious hip hop, KRS-One. And that's kind of like, as an MC, who inspired me. I ended up rhyming over house beats more than hip hop. So, I tend to be more about like trying to indoctrinate like music festivals and nightclubs and whatnot. That's sort of how I roll. And I do think that in musical spaces, in spaces where we hear music, we're in a recreational mode. And because we're in a recreational mode and not a work mode, we relate to each other differently. And I think we can see in recreational spaces glimmers of the brighter day that we might one be able to construct for each other. When we manage to get our collective boots off of each other's necks and allow people to thrive and survive, I think we can have more spaces where people can relate to each other, as we do in recreational spaces where people aren't threats. They're not competition. They're not somebody you have to sell anything to. They're just somebody else who you're in a space with, who you can have a chat with, maybe dance for a while. Like the idea of experiencing each other as friends that we haven't met yet, as opposed to presumptive enemies, which is how our capitalist economy constructs each other. I think of that as a profound social goal. And for me, that all came from the counterculture. I was part of the house music wave in Chicago. I caught it at the tail end of the original emergence of house music. And it was just a glorious, multiracial, amazing, beautiful expression of what America means. It was like urban America in that era. And it's kind of turned over and moved around the world since, and the kind of like sound of music that I particularly gravitate towards is like French house from like the mid 90s. And the stuff I produce is kind of different from all that. But I will say, for instance, I'm in the middle of the night when I'm not working on the campaign or writing my book, I'm working on an album, and the track I've been working on is a 3-verse history of the CIA over a dark tech track. So can't wait for you to hear that. And I will maybe shout out, the legions of people across all the different genres who are using their art constructively and as a documentary form. And I want to particularly shout out a couple artist collectives from the Stanford Spoken Word Collective, which I had a chance to co-found back in 2002. And they've been raging and rocking ever since. They hit like protest rallies, they hit open mics, they do shows. They're like so legit now, they have auditions and whatnot. It's very humbling for me to witness and how it's grown and evolved in the years since. Then there's a crew here in San Francisco that's been reclaiming public space with a politicized open mic every Thursday for 18 years. Very proud of that community. It's like a institution. If you're in SF, join us any Thursday night at 16th and Mission. I'm not always there, but the crew is. And then the DC Guerrilla Poetry Insurgency, which takes the battle to the nation's heart. Any artists who are using art in public space as a liberatory exercise, that is profound. Both because art is all the things that it is, heart connection, a way to speak to people in different dimensions, and because the reclamation of public space is the reclamation of stolen land. It is a profound act to reclaim public space, even if only in an ephemeral moment. And to use art as a way to bring people together in public, I have found to be just an incredibly compelling, connecting, amazing way to both hear voices. Like the action model we use in the San Francisco and DC groups is literally just like holding space and passing the mic. In San Francisco, there isn't even a mic, it's unamplified. So it's just like a cipher. And the whole point is, if you're passing by and you got something to say, like jump in, we want to hear you, and that receptivity to spontaneity. The things I've heard from people just passing by are riveting, and a lot of times, in fact, everybody in each of those crews who's in them or at some point just random people passing by who's stuck, and then there's community, and the idea of watching community blossom from atomization is honestly a beautiful thing. And life can be like that if we just get to a point where we don't treat each other as enemies, and if we can found and establish social norms that are built on cooperation and meeting our shared challenges together. The things that I've seen in creative and art spaces are, to me, have been really inspiring for that brighter vision of a better day.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, you brought up so many great points about the power of music and reclaiming public space, and so much of it reminded me of my own experience in the 90s and 2000s in New York City. You know, different sides of the country, but the effect is the same, and the community that derives from an artistic space and can happen on a street corner. It's
Yes.
pretty incredible. So I'm actually working on my next song
Okay.
with the same person who did the hook and the beat for the 10 Demands song and video.
Okay.
This one is for, you know, the marches, July 24th
Yeah.
for Medicare
Medicare
for All. So this is the anthem for that.
Nice.
And we're keeping it really short because people have really short attention spans, and we want it to fit on Twitter and be, you know, nice and to the point. But I'd like to do a remix, and I would like to invite you to join me on that if you're
Hell
interested.
yeah, dude. I'm so down. Yes,
All right.
totally.
All right,
For
cool.
sure.
So I'll be in touch about that.
All
And,
right.
you know, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your advocacy. Thank you for your bravery. Thank you for your help getting my damn Twitter back. You're an amazing guy. I really appreciate you. Keep doing what you're doing.
Thanks, homie. Right back at you. Thanks for having me on. Keep up the great
Yeah,
work. Hope to
my
see you again
pleasure.
soon.
All right, cool.
Peace.
Peace.